I've been given quite a simple task. It's to explain, or to try to explain, why are we all talking about change suddenly? And I'm thinking specifically in our sector. Why are we talking about it now? It's not just Bronson, which is under reconstruction. We're under reconstruction. And it's a challenge. It's a little scary, in fact. I suspect that some of you are feeling the uncertainty and the anxiety around working in an environment where some of the bearings that we've been able to rely on in the past are no longer so trustworthy. And we're being asked to rethink what we do, how we do it. So that's what I want to explore a little bit tonight, but then I know that Paul is going to take it further, and you're going to have a chance tomorrow to look and interact among yourselves about what are the implications for the work and the organizations that you're involved with. Let me just say beforehand, je vais faire ma présentation en anglais, mais évidemment après il y aura, comme Michael vient de dire, l'occasion de poser des questions et je serai certainement prêt à répondre en français. And I'm going to start by just painting a very quick picture of the world that we live in and what gave, in a sense, what was the impetus for the document that I wrote a while back called Not Letting a Crisis Go to Waste, which most of you will remember was actually a comment made by the Chief of Staff of President Obama, Emmanuel Ram, referring to the financial meltdown of 2008. And he said,
"You never want a serious crisis to go to waste. And what I mean by that, it's an opportunity to do things that you think you could not do before."
And I thought, well, that's sort of where we are. We are facing a number of very serious, almost existential challenges, but it's also an opportunity for renewal. It's just that we need to get through the period of chaos and crisis and see where there are opportunities for us to actually be more successful and more effective in carrying out our mandates. The crisis for us is not one of people in our sector. It's, of course, at a much different scale. But it's important, I think, to mention it because I think there has been a tendency for many of us to say, well, yes, we're under pressure for sure. Government is cutting back in many ways. The economic situation is not altogether reassuring, but we've been through this before. We went through this in the 1990s, and although it was painful and there was a lot of collateral damage, we managed to sort of do more with less, tighten our belts, whatever the phrase is that comforts us in thinking that we can just muddle through. This is not the 1990s. And I think the fundamental difference that we need to bear in mind is that we are facing a new economic situation. In the 1990s, Canada was facing a crisis of accumulated debt and government deficits, but it was almost alone in tackling this as vigorously as it did. In other words, the economies all around us, upon whom to some extent we depend for trade and so on, they were all still growing. And therefore, Canada was able to, in a sense, tackle some of the hard economic challenges it faced, but in a context where the global economy was pretty robust. Not only that, but the Canadian population was growing. So there's a certain economic robustness just in the fact that we have more people, more producers, more consumers. This is no longer the case today. We are in a slow or no growth economy, but on a global scale this time, and one in which governments are being urged to, of course, rein in deficits, but individuals are also being told that we have to, in a sense, deleverage, take on less credit, less financial risk. All of this compresses, of course, the economic circumstances, and a population which essentially is pretty close to stagnant, except for the arrival of immigrants and refugees. That's where the population growth is these days. So one of those PowerPoint slides sums it up. Average economic growth in the past was about 3% a year. At present, the best estimates are perhaps 2% going forward, but even that I think we would say we'd be relatively lucky to achieve. The expected investment return, if you look at the TSX over the last 30, 40 years, was around 9.5%. Now we're talking about 4.5%, again, if we're lucky. Subtract inflation, and what you're seeing, and this is important for organizations that depend upon grants that are being made out of endowment funds, what you're seeing is virtually no growth whatsoever. The population growth in 2000 was over 1% per annum. It's projected that in 2011 it was less than 0.8%. So that's a significant drop. That's a 20% drop. And the labor participation rate, which is something we hear a lot about these days as we talk about the impact on pensions, has dropped from 67% of Canadians of working age being in the labor force to about 60 or 62% within the next 15 years. So it's a different economic situation that we're facing. And this isn't to discourage us, it's simply to state that hunkering down and waiting for things to improve is actually not going to get us through this. We have to think, how does this affect the way, in a sense, our business model, our whole way of developing programming and looking for the funds necessary to carry them out. But of course, this is only part of the picture. Quite apart from looking at the economic changes, there's also a shift in what we expect government to do at all levels. There's a shift in what citizens expect to do now. We have technologies which allow us potentially to play a much greater and more direct role than was the case in the past. The notion of representative government in this context is being questioned by many people. I could go on, but I think the essentials are clear to everybody. What are the implications in terms of the funding for the work that is done at the community level? Well, again, there's a significant shift. If we look at the major sources of funding, which are government grants, donations and foundation grants, earned revenue, basically what we see is government, of course, being the most significant at 43%, if we look at the core charities. Donations and foundation grants at around 30%, earned revenue 17%. But this, of course, disguises a much more complex reality, because if you look at different kinds of organizations, the pattern of revenue generation is very different. So if you look at the chart, which looks at revenues coming either from government or private sources, and of organizations as being mainly engaged either in the provision of services or what I call more expressive activities, you can plot where organizations fit within this, so that the impact of declining government support particularly affects organizations, of course, that are providing services that have been funded largely by government. On the other hand, organizations that have largely relied on private funding, such as environmental groups, for example, or human rights organizations, or other organizations of that sort, they're going to be less impacted perhaps by cuts in government funding, but the stagnation of the donor base is something which worries them significantly. So we can talk about, in the aggregate, the impact of these funding changes, but we have to be much clearer when it comes to what kinds of organizations and how important each source of funding is. What is clear is that regardless of what the funding source is, there is an evolution in terms of the thinking, the motivation, the means whereby assets are transferred. So if we look at how expectations and motivations have evolved, we've moved from a whole set of relationships that were developed over the years with government, which we actually became quite comfortable with, which largely had to do with relatively reliable support for the operating costs of the organizations that most of us are involved with, towards something Something new, which is much more project-based. We've seen this over the last couple of years, a reluctance to fund overhead costs, for example, and the pressures and strains that creates for organizations. Increasing emphasis on accountability for results. In terms of corporate funding, what was in the past often the philanthropic arm of what corporations were doing, their sort of, their community support, giving back to the community, often completely unconnected with what their principal corporate purposes were. But over the last few years, these have tended to come together, and increasingly, companies are linking their philanthropic activities to their corporate goals. Again, significant implications for organizations working in the community which have relied in the past on relatively unattached corporate funding. Individuals, as we know, are in the process perhaps of moving away from a loyalty to organizations towards a much greater interest in supporting causes. People are less interested in organizations as such. And instead, there's a more episodic, there's less of an attachment to organizations and a more of an interest in looking for the causes that for some reason have a particular appeal. And of course, foundations, not a large sector in Canada, but not negligible either. They've gone from, in the past, project funding, largely responsive, waiting until organizations came to them with requests, to something which is much more strategic, much more focused, and much more hands-on. Now, I would argue that we're actually already seeing a move away from this new world, which I've just described, which itself has imposed a number of difficult adjustments on the part of many community organizations towards something even newer. We hear echoes of this when the federal government and the provincial governments, for that matter, start talking about performance-based funding, results-based funding, new mechanisms like social impact bonds. What does that mean for organizations working in the sector? How capable are we of actually generating hard data which demonstrates the results of our work? For corporations, there's a similar, very significant change. You're now hearing organizations, corporate organizations talking about creating shared value. In other words, not having this distinction between their economic, their financial returns purposes and the way in which they create a public benefit. An example of this might be Bullfrog Power. Bullfrog Power is working in the area of creating alternative energy sources, but they're doing so for a financial purpose. They're doing this partly because it's, in their view, the right thing to do to encourage this shift towards more sustainable energy sources, but partly because there's a strong business case for doing it. So the notion that there is not necessarily this rigid distinction between entities looking for financial return exclusively or looking for social benefit exclusively, that there actually is a growing sort of blurring of that boundary is one which I think we need to pay attention to. It's not yet very visible in Canada, but it is certainly being spoken of a lot more in the United States, and interestingly, often by the very large multinational corporations, precisely because they are so big that they actually have to look at the global picture.
The social enterprise will be the differentiator for HP in how we interact with our customers, our employees, and our partners.
And we're obviously evolving our capabilities to make sure that we truly can be seen as a social enterprise, both in terms of how we communicate internally and how we communicate with our customers.
My name is Mike Britton. I'm Managing Director of Goodwill Solutions. The commercial side of Goodwill Solutions allows us to create social change without seeking funding. For example, we do free or discounted furniture to charity and welfare organisations. Also, we provide back-to-work training and back-to-work programs for ex-offenders and recovering drug and alcohol users.
they can't afford to do what unfortunately, many of our corporations are doing, which is focusing only on their sector. Individuals, we've seen what I just mentioned, the more episodic concern with particular causes that appeal to individuals. But of course, there's also the interest in a sense, cutting the middleman out, using some of the new technological tools, the communication tools, to go directly from donor to beneficiary. I mean, you have the microfinance loans that could be made through Kiva. You have, in New York, you have ways in which individuals can go online, identify a school in their neighborhood which needs used computers or books or whatever, and people can make a direct donation without going through any other intermediary or middleman. Interesting. There are implications in this too, I think. And finally, just to deal with the last one, the foundation source, I think here too there's a significant change taking place. Partly because, as I mentioned earlier, the returns on endowments are so low. People in foundations are increasingly saying, we have an asset that we are not sufficiently using, which is indeed the corpus of the endowment. We are using, of course, the return, the interest and the dividends that we receive from our endowment to make grants. But what would happen if we used the billions of dollars that are tied up in foundation assets to actually invest in activities in the community which which help to advance our fundamental purposes? So this is the field of impact investing, and it's it's accelerating remarkably quickly. It's an idea which really hasn't been around all that long. It's only been about 2 years that one started hearing about the notion of impact investing, and already there are community foundations that are way out ahead, including here in Ottawa, and showing what is possible by using not just the returns on the endowment, but the endowment itself as a tool for creating public value. So, we're in a period of flux. Scary in some ways because it requires that we understand where these trends are moving and how we can best position ourselves to take full advantage of them, but in other ways, I think, creating enormous opportunities. I'm going quickly through this because I want to hear Paul. Let's step back a bit. I would say that we're moving into the third generation, you might say, of the work we're doing. We're moving from the earliest expression of people wanting to contribute to the well-being, the health of their communities, which essentially was charity. The purpose was to alleviate suffering, to meet cases of need. And the motivation was largely compassion, something which is enjoined by every religion and every progressive set of values. If you see people who are suffering, then as people who are of the same community, out of fellow feeling, we want to do something to help. This morphed, I think, over the last 50 years into something called philanthropy. And philanthropy I would distinguish from charity because it's not just about alleviating suffering, it's also about solving problems. The motivation is not just virtue, it's not just doing what is right, it's also the sense of generosity or altruism which leads people to voluntarily contribute some of their resources, their time, what they have to help others or the community at large. I think we're moving now into something that we might call good citizenship.